Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. This is our fourth webinar in this fiscal year. This is our final webinar for this fiscal year. We'll start again this summer with our new quarterly webinars, but we're so excited to have you join us. Today, we're going to be talking about regulations. Regulations 101, understanding and complying with federal policy. My name is Michelle C. Blackburn. I'm the Director of Policy at the Institute for Educational Leadership and at the Coalition for Community Schools. And I'm so excited to have you talk with me today about this topic. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so we're going to talk about how to read and understand regulations. You'll have the opportunity to ask me questions. We'll talk about upcoming events that we have at IEL and the Coalition for Community Schools, and then you'll have a chance to tell us how we did and how we can improve for next fiscal year for all of you. So a little bit about IEL. We change systems through people, and that we consider ourselves movement builders. We really do everything in service to underserved leaders, equipping them with knowledge, skills, and abilities to transform their communities through education with collaborative solutions that work for all. A little bit about what we do. We partner with communities to help fill services and needs and support them in their long-term on their transformational leadership journey. In the year 2025, we reached over 460 school districts. We worked with 18,000 schools and we impacted 12 million students. Additionally, we offered a lot of services for adults. So we do technical assistance and professional development. We do networks and causes, and we do events and initiatives, just like the one that you're attending today, our webinar. So this is really designed to help build your capacity to make you a more dynamic leader and really expand your skill set so that you can best serve your students in your community. So today we're talking all about regulations. And I just want to pause and let you know that you will have a chance to ask questions. So if you have them, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. We'll also have a Q&A session at the end. So feel free to just go ahead and add those and we'll be sure to address them at the end of the presentation. So why do we talk about regulations? What is important about regulations? Really, when it comes to the policy world, but also just in compliance and your everyday life, understanding regulations is the key to knowing what the law actually says and how to ensure not only to be in compliance, but also what your rights and obligations are. In my opinion, knowing how to access, read, and comprehend the federal code is a superpower. My goal today is to turn you all into superheroes by the end of this presentation. So when I say what the law actually says versus what you think it says, a good example of this is with the rule FERPA, or the federal statute FERPA, the Federal Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974, of which I'm a researcher and expert on. So a lot of people are afraid to share information because it might be perceived as being a FERPA violation. So knowing what actually is a FERPA violation and what the impacts or consequences are if you do not comply with FERPA is really important. So for example, in FERPA, there's no private right of action, meaning that you can't sue. So a parent can't sue a school district or a teacher if they think there's been a FERPA violation. The proper remedy for a FERPA violation is to go through an investigation and remediation with the Department of Education. So knowing that at the end of the day, you can't be sued for a violation, that at worst that happens is you have to go meet with somebody, an investigator at the Department of Education. And if you're found in violation, that you might be subject to a fine. For some, might actually make people feel a little bit more comforted knowing that they understand how the law works and what it actually says versus what they think it might be or what they might have been told the implications are of that law. So that's what we're talking about today, is for you to understand what the law actually says, how it impacts your day to day, and how you can move forward courageously, knowing and understanding what the law means to you in your everyday life. So with that, what is a regulation? So we hear these terms: statute, rules, guidelines, regulations. What all does this mean? We're going to cover all of that in our presentation today. So first of all, a regulation is a rule or requirement. People use the term regulation or rule intermittently or interchangeably. It's issued by a federal agency to implement laws passed by Congress. They carry the force of law. They build on a statute passed by Congress and signed into law by a president. And they can include penalties for noncompliance. So like I was referencing earlier, A FERPA violation might be subject to a fee, but you can't sue for damages under that law. So a statute, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but a statute is a law passed by a legislative body. A regulation builds upon that framework created by the statute. So Congress relies on the expertise of agencies to fill in those gaps for the laws that they pass. For example, a member of Congress may have expertise in a specific area, but cannot bring the breadth and depth and know-how needed to practically promulgate laws. Therefore, agencies which have been working, which have working knowledge of best practices of their respective fields, tons of experts, tons of experience on these things, they can then create the rules needed for organizations or individuals to be in compliance with that law. Moreover, sometimes bills can simply lack details. This can be due to the need to expedite policy, like the American Rescue Plan, for example, or because Congress is relying on the agency to do the work out the details for them. So we often see this in appropriation bills where Congress may fund a grant program, but relies on the agency to administer and make rules regarding the grant program. For example, the Full Service Community School Program, Congress passes money to fund that, but it's up to the Department of Education to create the rules around that grant program and how they're going to administer the funds. So we see Congress creating the systems and structures, but really those federal agencies filling in the gaps. That's where regulations come into play. So why do regulations matter? So like I said, it creates compliance and accountability structures. It ensures laws are updated to the current context. So some laws have been created 50, 60 years ago and don't necessarily make sense in a current context. So regulations allow agencies to come in and say, all right, we're going to update this language, we're going to update how the world actually works these days, and we're going to make sure that these rules make sense for a 21st century context. It allows experts to provide best practices and fills in the gaps left by Congress, like we just discussed. And it gives the public the opportunity to provide feedback, which we'll talk about in just a second. You actually have the right to help decide how laws are made in our country, or how rules and regulations are made in our country. So how is a regulation different from a statute or federal guideline? So we talked a little bit about this earlier, but statutes are laws passed by a governing body like Congress, or it could be your state legislature, or even your state or your local city council, and are enacted by a president or another executive power. And guidelines are issued by federal agencies that clarify how to read regulations or how an agency is interpreting the policies, but don't carry the weight of law. So the difference between regulations and rules and guidelines is confusing, but regulations must be created in compliance with the Administrative Procedures Act, whereas guidelines do not. Guidelines do not carry the force of law. I think that's the most important thing for you to know. And we'll dig into that a little bit later. So, can regulations change? Like I said, yes, sometimes they do change for various reasons. But it's important to note that any changes to a regulation must be made through a process of compliance with a law that's called the Administrative Procedures Act, or the APA. So federal lawsuits or the Supreme Court opinions can change regulations if they are found to be unconstitutional or outside statutory authority. Executive orders cannot overturn or invalidate regulations, but guidelines can change the way an agency plans to interpret or enforce laws, like Dear Colleague letters. So for example, there was a famous Dear Colleague letter in 2011 in which the Obama administration's interpretation of Title IX did not change the law itself, but the guidance it created, again, insight as to how the administration is interpreting it, but not changing the law exactly, said that the administration would broaden the school's obligation to protect its students from sexual harassment. It didn't change Title IX, but it did let schools know that under that administration's interpretation of Title IX, that it was more expansive and that schools were responsible for being in compliance with their new interpretation of that regulation. The letter was then rescinded by the first Trump administration. So the law never changed, just the guidance and how that law was being interpreted changed from administration to administration. Under that new guidance, a person or organization cannot be found criminally or civilly liable for violating the guidelines, but may face an investigation or penalties for not being in compliance. So it didn't require an act of Congress. It just simply said, we are now changing the way that we understand this law to be in place and to be enforceable. So I talked a little bit about the Administrative Procedures Act, and this is an important law that allows you the opportunity to provide insight and commentary on how rules should be created. So it was passed in 1946, so it's been in place for a long time, and it establishes the procedure that federal agencies must follow to create, amend, or repeal regulations. It encourages public participation as well as uniformity and transparency by agencies. So the APA allows or requires all agencies to go through the same process. So, for example, the Department of Labor cannot have a different process through which they make rules than the Department of Education or the Department of Defense. They all have to follow the same process. The APA also allows for judicial review for parties who are adversely affected by the rules under this federal statute. You'll see the code there, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second of how to read and understand that. But an example of this judicial review is that courts can overturn actions deemed arbitrary and capricious and abuse of discretion or otherwise not in accordance with federal law. So, for example, if OSHA, which is at the Department of Labor, made a rule that all people with blonde hair have to wear a safety vest in their workplace, regardless of what that workplace looks like, that could be a violation of an authorization violation. So, for example, the agency does not have the oversight or the constitutional authority to make that rule. Another example of that constitutional violation, would be the Department of Education makes a rule that American history courses must include a unit on Paul Revere. The Department of Education does not have statutory authority to set curriculum. Sorry, I bumped my mouse. The Ed does not have statutory authority to set curriculum, or the Department of Education cannot make a rule that would impact another agency. For example, they can't say a rule for the administration of children and families, which is housed at the Health and Human Services Department. So you have to have authority within your agency to make those rules, and you have to be ensured that you have constitutional authority to make the rules in the first place. That being said, the court cannot substitute its own judgment for the agency. It can only examine the relevant data and articulate a satisfactory explanation for its decision. So in other words, the court cannot change the regulation itself. It can just say whether or not that agency has the ability to make that regulation or rule in the first place. So that's a little bit of background on the APA. What does any of this have to do with you? Well, here's another way of looking at the APA. This is the process through which a regulation is made. The most important part that you need to know about is that you get to engage in the public comment component. So going back a little bit, Congress passes a law, it becomes a statute. Then it is passed over to the Federal Register, which says that an authorized federal agency is going to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking and establishes a proposed rule in the Federal Register. So say the Department of Education creates a new grant program. They say, here are the rules that are going to govern this new grant program. They put it on the Federal Register, and then they open it up for public comment. All new regulations are legally required to go through a public comment period, which is between 30 and 60 days and can last up to 180 days, depending upon how complex the rules are. And any member of the public can submit a written comment on the proposed rulemaking during the comment period. At a minimum, it has to be open for 30 days. Then after that, a federal agency reviews and responds to all of those rules or comments and incorporates the relevant feedback and publishes those final rules, including a preamble and rule text, onto the Federal Register. The Federal Code of Regulations. And then the agency may choose to withdraw their proposal based upon whether or not the comments the public provided make it seem like it's a reasonable rule. So they get so much feedback that's negative, they may decide to revoke that rule or withdraw that proposal. Then, once it's published onto the Code of Federal Regulations, it becomes effective no less than 30 days from publication on the Federal Register. There are some exceptions to that. So like I said, anyone in the public can submit a comment on any proposed rule that they find on the Federal Register, including the process to submit a comment. The federal agencies are required to read and respond to each comment which can't be done through summarization. And they're allowed to go through and weed out irrelevant or offensive comments. For example, the proposed rules about using AI tools to track student attendance, and the comment is about regulating school lunches. That's not relevant to the rulemaking. It might be relevant to something else, but it's not relevant to the rule that's immediately in front of the agency. So that comment may be thrown out. The issues may be related, but kids aren't coming to school if they're not going to be able to eat while they're at school. So school meals and attendance may be correlated, but it doesn't directly deal with the rule that's in front of the agency. They're trying to determine whether or not they should move forward with the proposed rule. So that's how you come into play. At the end of this, I actually have a guide on how you can submit public comment. Some people, they might submit 2 words of a comment. Some people might create 5 pages worth of comments. It just depends on what the rule is. But anyone is able to comment on any rule within the Federal Register. So where do you find regulations? Where do you find the Federal Register? The Federal Register provides a daily update of proposed rules, notice for public comment, potential grant opportunities, etc. All you have to do is Google Code of just Federal Register, and you can find it. Then, once those rules are finalized, they move to the Code of Federal Regulations. And think of it like a phone book where all the federal rules and laws can be found. So all you have to do is you can look up what your subject matter is within the Code of Federal Regulations, or the ECFR, the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations, and you can find whatever you're looking for. It's just like the phone book. And I'm actually going to walk you through that process right now. So how do you read a regulation? So if you see on this first screenshot right here, this is what the ECFR looks like. It's simply just titles, and each agency or each department has its own title. As you can see here, most education laws fall under Title 34. So all I did is I just keep drilling down, and I go to education, which is Title 34, and you can see all the education laws. Obviously, there's way more laws on the books than just this, but this is just a quick summary of how you continue to just drill down and find what you're looking for. So as we do that, you can see here I've clicked on Title 34 or Title 34 education, and I'm trying to find Title I laws within education. So this is what it looks like on the Federal Register. This is what the actual text of the law looks like here on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side. So you can see this is the actual text of the law for Title I. Reading a regulation and finding specific rules is just like reading an outline. There's a section header, so you can see over here we have education, and then you just keep drilling down into the various topics. As you can see here, we also have CFR, that's the Code of Federal Regulations, and USCS is the United States Code. That's statutes. We'll talk about that in just 1 second. So the citation breakdown for Title I is 34 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200. It's also issued under federal statute, 20 United States Code 6301. These are the exact same law, they're just listed in different places. They mean the same thing. So how do you read a regulation when you see a citation like this? What on earth does that mean? So, like I said, anytime you see CFR, that means Code of Federal Regulations. Anytime you see USC, that's United States Code. So let's break this down a little bit. So 34 CFR, this is going to tell you what title in the Code of Federal Regulations you can find it. We know that any code that's starts with 34 is going to be education related. So this is the title in the Code of Federal Regulations. This symbol right here means section, right? Anytime you see this means section or subsection. So within Title 34 of the Code of Regulations, we're looking for section 200.1. So this is a specific section or part or specific rule. So we know this is where we can find Title I. And then we just keep drilling down, keep going down just like an outline. We see this section, it just has more specific information, details, requirements, exemptions, etc. So we start with the big main topic. We go down and we can just keep drilling down to get more and more details, just like any outline that you might have. What does this look like on the page? So here we have a screenshot of the eCFR. So we have Title 34 right here. We have Section 200.1 right here, Subpart A, Section 200.1, state responsibilities for developing challenging academic standards. And then right here, B1I is academic content standards. And we just keep looking and drilling down and drilling down. So we know B, here's one, and here's I right here. So we're looking for specifically what all students are expected to know and be able to do under this federal code within this section. So really, when you think about reading a statute or, excuse me, a regulation, it's not necessarily like reading a novel. It's more like reading an outline where you're looking for specific components of a specific law. You don't always have to read the same thing, the whole thing in one piece. Sometimes you just need to break it down to relevant parts. So moreover, reading a federal regulation, always start with the purpose section of the regulation. This will help you understand why this regulation exists and if you're even looking at the right rules. Sometimes you might be thinking you're looking at the right thing and realize, oh, actually this section is not applicable to me. What might that look like? For example, referring back to FERPA, the rules for K through 12 and higher education are very different. So if you're reading a specific section of a law of a regulation for FERPA that is only applicable to K through 12 students, and you're in a higher ed context, it's irrelevant to you. You do not have to pay attention to that part of the part of the law. So always make sure you read the purpose section so you know that you're actually reading things that are applicable to you. Don't skip the definitions. If you have any takeaway from this entire presentation, do not skip reading the definitions. This might be the most important part of regulation. Why on earth do reading definitions matter? So a definition for a regulation may not be the same thing as the common definition for everyday use, or what you intuitively might think might be the definition. This is the working definition for the purposes of this regulation. And the same word might mean different things in different laws or different regulations. So take the term student or attendance, those specific words have a very common meaning in everyday vernacular, but might be different when it comes to Title IX versus FERPA. For example, in FERPA, the definition of a student changes depending upon the student's age or where they're enrolled. So what is applicable to what makes them an eligible student in FERPA if they're in a higher ed situation is different than what it is if they're just in high school. This is why you have to read the definitions to make sure you understand what the law is actually saying, making sure that you're interpreting it correctly and able to be in compliance correctly. And like I said, read it section by section like an outline, not all at once like a novel. So read the things that you're specifically looking for, not necessarily like one big piece of prose that you're trying to understand. The more key parts of reading regulation, this is also very important. When you see the word shall in any rule, law, statute, guidelines, it is a requirement. You can basically say must instead of shall means must. May means can, or it's allowable. You can do this thing. You don't have to, but you can. You should, or you can. It's recommended. And then should is that it's advisable. So we recommend that you do these things. It's not a requirement. It's not a may, but if you want to, have the best outcomes, you should do this. We advise that you do this. You engage in this practice. If a regulation references another rule, take the time to refer to and learn about that regulation. I'll show you an example of what this looks like in real life in a second. But always take the time to cross-reference and make sure you understand, because sometimes instead of spelling out that entire rule all over again, they'll just reference it and you are responsible for being in compliance with what that other rule says as well. Again, I'll show you an example of this in just a second. Read it first and then try to assess your current context. What a lot of people do when they read a regulation is they have what they want to find in their mind, and then they try to read the rule and superimpose those rules onto their current context. That's not the best thing to do because you might find that you have to change some of your practices depending upon what the rule says. So always read it for face value, try to comprehend it on its own merits, and then assess it and apply it to your current context. Don't try to proof text and think that the rule says what it says based upon your current context. We do this all the time as people. This is very, very normal for people to do. So it's a hard practice to break sometimes. but it's really best to just try to read it on its own and then try to assess it based upon what you're doing in your current context. So a couple other things about reading a regulation. So always keep in mind the who, what, why, where, and how, just like in journalism or in storytelling. So the who, the requirements or exemptions for who must be in compliance. So who was the audience for this law? Two, what requirements for actions, restrictions, or compliance are there being articulated or promulgated within this rule? When, requirements for action or compliance timelines or frequency. So what has to happen within what time frame or how frequently do you have to engage in a practice? These are things you need to know about. The why does this even exist in the first place? We talked about this a little bit in the preamble. Why are rules important? Why is this rule needed? And then finally, the how. So the requirements for how to stay in compliance. Most rules will include this of what you need to do, how you need to do it, when you need to do it, who you need to contact. So basically that is really the crux of most rules and regulations is the how, the requirement for to stay in compliance. So what does this look like on the page? What does this look like in the text? So here's an example of how to write a regulation for FERPA, the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act of 1974. So if we look at it, we have the authority, the authorizing statute. So here you can see 20 United States Code 1232G, unless otherwise noted, on the source within the Federal Register, stating when they made this last rule. So you always have the authorizing regulation, so you know this is where it comes from and when it was last in the Federal Register. So then we have like I said earlier, if we keep scrolling down, subpart A, general. So this is the preamble. This is why this rule exists in the first place. And it references this other federal statute or federal statute 99.10. So, what this is telling us is that unless otherwise noted, who is defined within this regulation, this law is applicable to. So you need to read that regulation to understand who is this applicable to. They're not going to go through and take the time to explain it. They've already explained it in another section. So that's why you need to cross-reference and make sure you read the citations and the references to make sure that you understand what you're responsible for. And like I said earlier, within the who, we have an exemption to regulations right here. Here's an example of this. This part does not apply to an educational agency or institution solely because its students attending that agency or institution receive non-monetary benefits under a program reference in paragraph A, again, referencing another section, if no funds of that program are made available to the agency or institution. In other words, institutions that do not receive federal funding are not subject to FERPA compliance. That's what that rule is saying. I know this because I have researched this law significantly, but basically that's what it's trying to tell you. You know that when you reference this paragraph right here. So reading a federal regulation can be difficult. It can be more like reading an outline than a piece of prose. But if you take the time to really give yourself the space, give yourself the ability to really do that work to cross-reference, they're not that hard to understand. The language may be a little clunky because reading laws can be a little clunky, but really if you take the time to break it down, it's just like reading an outline. Here's another example, like I said, don't skip the definitions. Section 99.3 is the definitions for this federal statute. And this goes on for quite some time. So anytime you see the act, that's referencing that is the statute referencing itself. So similar to like when you put something in parentheses to be a term for an organization like IEL, we just refer to it as IEL as opposed to it's for educational or education leadership in every citation. We just say IEL. That's what this is doing here, this act. Attendance, for example, this is the definition for attendance specifically to this law. It might be different in other laws, so that's why you always have to pay attention to the definition. One of the things that's interesting here is how comprehensive this definition is. So it includes not just sitting at a desk in a physical classroom, but paper correspondence, online learning, video conferencing, when a student is at a work study program, so they don't have to be physically on that specific campus, they could be on a remote campus. So it's really important that you understand what is encompassing each definition. And then again, we have another reference to another rule, another definition further down. So that's how you read a regulation in the actual text. Uh, so here are some references that I want to provide to you all on how to on more on understanding regulation. So the Library of Congress, How to Trace Federal Regulations, A Beginner's Guide. The Federal Register actually provides guidance on how to read it and how to understand it and how to submit a comment. The State Authorization Network, Reading Federal Statutes and Regulations, I found that actually be a really great tool while creating this presentation of how to really break this stuff down for people who may not have a legal background. And then you also have the American Bar Association for 5 tips for reading legislation and code. This is also pretty comprehensive, and even though it's designed for attorneys, it's actually a very great tool for a layperson to better understand. So if you want to dig deeper on this topic, you are welcome to do so using some of these resources. You can also look at CRS, Congressional Research Service. They also provide a lot of tools as well to really help Americans understand how Congress works and how this process works. If you want the historical background on it, how this process came about, how the American Procedures Act came about, I recommend that you check out those resources as well. And with that, I will pause our slideshow and open up the floor for any questions people may have. Are there any questions in the chat? Right, it doesn't look like we have any questions in the chat, but I hope that this was a helpful, informative webinar for all of you today. I know this was a little bit different from our typical webinar where we have a panel discussion, but this one is designed because it's a little bit more of a how-to guide. We thought it was more appropriate to have more of a presentation style as opposed to a conversation with panelists to really give you the opportunity to understand how to break this down and do it on your own. Right. So it looks like there's no questions in the chat, but I will tell you that we are going to post this webinar on our YouTube channel. We have it recorded. So if you want to reference it at any point in time, you're welcome to do that. To go back and look at our recording to kind of break this down. I know I went through it rather quickly because I want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. And while you're thinking of any questions you may have, I'm going to share my screen again to share with you a few announcements. So one of the things that you can do is you can sign up for Everyone an Advocate. We have on-demand e-badge courses. You can sign up for those at any point in time. Another thing I want to make sure that I share with all of you is our conference is coming up next month very, very quickly. So registration is still open. Please join us in Long Beach for the National Community Schools Family and Engagement, National Community Schools and Family Engagement Conference in Long Beach, California, May 27th through the 29th. Registration is still open. I believe we have our site visits posted on our website. We have our conference sessions, our pre-cons. I'll be giving a pre-con on advocacy if you want to learn how to do that with your team. So we encourage you to join us at the end of next month for that. And we also have an evaluation. We can put this in the chat. Let us know how we did and how we can improve for our next webinar. That will probably be coming out in the summer or early fall. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there's any other questions in the chat. And if not, we'll call it a day. All right, it looks like there's no other questions, but thank you so much for joining us all today. And we hope to see you in Long Beach. Thanks, everyone.